Coming up on Arirang News. A new chapter opens in the relationship between South Korea and Japan following the fence-mending summit today in Tokyo. Leaders of the two countries agreed to strengthen their friendship, resume active diplomacy, confront threats from the North together, and take steps to further resolve trade disputes. Japan decides to lift its export curbs on South Korea for key industry materials. The curbs were first imposed in 2019 and triggered a bitter trade spat between the two neighbors. In response, Seoul is to suspend its complaint with the World Trade Organization. North Korea fired yet another ballistic missile ahead of the Yoon summit. This time, it was a long-range missile toward the East Sea, and it's already their sixth ballistic missile provocation this year. Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in South Korea. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. We begin with a summit between the leaders of South Korea and Japan that took place in Tokyo today. President Yoon sat down with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to discuss how to mend fences between the two governments and work towards a future-oriented relationship. They held a joint press conference declaring a new chapter in bilateral relations. We connect with our top office correspondent, Oh Soo-young, who is traveling with the president. So, hi Soo-young, let's begin with some of the biggest outcomes from the meeting.
Hi, Jeong. Yes, so I'm standing outside the Prime Minister's residence, Japanese Prime Minister's residence, rather, where the two leaders met just hours ago. And, well, as you said, there were some very important outcomes from their summit talks today in terms of overcoming some of the biggest sticking points in bilateral relations. First off, with trade. So President Yoon said that Japan has ended its export curbs of semiconductor materials to South Korea as of today, and Seoul has also halted its dispute resolution process at the World Trade Organization over Japan's export measures. President Yoon said the two sides would continue discussions to reinstate each other as trusted trade partners in their respective so-called white lists. The aim of this summit, of course, was to normalize relations between the two countries that fell to a critical low in 2019, during which Japan slapped export restrictions on semiconductor materials to South Korea. Now, this was due to unresolved disputes and sentiments over historical issues, primarily the issue of compensating Koreans who were subjected to forced labor by Japanese firms during World War II. Now, the Yoon government announced a plan earlier this month to compensate the victims through private funding without demanding reparations from Japanese firms. Now, this was hailed as a breakthrough move by Tokyo and Washington amid efforts to ramp up trilateral cooperation and regional security, especially as they address growing threats from North Korea. Since then, the momentum for rapprochement has been building at incredible speed, culminating in this breakthrough summit today. Now, another major announcement was the South Korean president declaring that the intel sharing pact between Seoul and Tokyo is now fully functioning. The General Security of Military Information Agreement, or JSOMIA for short, enables the exchange of sensitive information such as intelligence on North Korea's missiles. Now, the agreement was almost scrapped back in 2019 at the height of Seoul-Tokyo tensions, but now it's back to fully functioning today. Moving forward, the two leaders said they will launch a bilateral economic security dialogue.
Well, there wasn't a joint statement by the two leaders, but it seems they're eager to continue talking and improving their ties.
That's right, Young. So there wasn't a joint statement that came out of the summit between President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida, but it's quite clear that the two leaders are very much on the same page when it comes to building up their future-oriented ties between South Korea and Japan. And, well, let's listen to what President Yoon had to say.
한국과 일본은 자유, 인권, 법치에 보편적 가치를 공유하고 안보, 경제, 글로벌 어젠다에서 공동의 이익을 추구하는 가장 가까운 이웃이자 협력해야 할 파트너입니다.
Japan has also described South Korea as an important partner in recent weeks amid efforts to ramp up trilateral cooperation with the United States on regional and economic security. And there has been some controversy about Seoul's plan to compensate victims of Japan's forced labor. But the leaders have made it clear that they're focusing on building trust and looking to the future, in the spirit of the 1998 declaration made by former President Kim Dae-jung and Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi. Yoon and Kishida both expressed their willingness to engage in active diplomacy and meet whenever necessary without being constrained by formalities.
So on that note, the two leaders have been enjoying some personal time together with a two-part dinner, according to rumors.
Right, there has been some interesting speculations about what these two leaders are going to eat, first of all, and how many dinners they're going to have. And, well, it seems that they should be wrapping up their dinner engagement by now. And, well, Japanese press reported previously that there would be a two-part dinner with a Japanese hot pot and an omelette dish that President Yoon is known to be quite partial to. Seoul's top office says that the dinner engagement was arranged indeed to provide the time and space needed for the leaders to build that trust on a personal level. And well, we're going to have to see whether the Japanese Prime Minister will invite South Korea to the G7 meeting in May in Hiroshima, and that would set the scene for a trilateral summit with the United States. And there's of course the speculation that Kishida is considering visiting Seoul in a reciprocal visit in the summer after hosting the G7 meeting.
Thank you, Soo-young, for being out there for us tonight. That was our top office correspondent, Oh Soo-young, who is traveling with the president. In related news, on this day of the two leaders sitting down for talks, Japan has decided to lift its years-long export curbs on three key materials needed in chip production. In response, South Korea withdraws its WTO dispute. Lee Dae-yeon has more.
Japan has lifted its export curbs to South Korea on three key materials for chip production: hydrogen fluoride, fluorine PI, and photoresist. This comes as a result of a three-day dialogue held by the trade ministries of South Korea and Japan. In response, South Korea will withdraw its WTO complaint filed against Japan.
Following the lifting of the export curbs, the required trade documents for the three materials will be simplified and the process shortened. We expect companies' uncertainties to be resolved.
South Korea has seen over $15 billion in economic losses due to its checkered relationship with Japan, as Tokyo in 2019 imposed export controls on chemical vitals to Seoul's chip industry. Now all eyes are on whether South Korea will be back on Japan's whitelist of favored trade partners. South Korea's Director General for Trade Controls Policy says it's hard to know when South Korea will be back on the list, but will pledge to work on the quick restoration of its whitelist status. Meanwhile, the Federation of Korean Industries and the Japan Business Federation announced on Thursday that a future partnership fund will be set up. According to a statement, the fund will be used to promote exchange programs for young talents and to launch study projects on future cooperation. These will include strengthening international relations, digital transformation, and sustainable development goals.
This is a momentum in a bilateral economic security cooperation that can lead to a variety of co-investments. Though there are some variables, it's a positive message that the two countries can make investment exchanges.
On top of that, the Japanese newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun reported that President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida are expected to announce plans for a council regarding the two countries' economic security dialogue. Other newspapers in Japan have reported that President Yoon has highlighted the cooperation between South Korea, the U.S., Japan, and Taiwan, the leading countries in the chip industry, to stabilize supply chain issues. Lee Dae-yeon, Arirang News.
Now, following news of the groundbreaking summit, foreign media outlets have been quick to report on the bilateral between Seoul and Tokyo. Some called it a milestone for future diplomacy, while others remained skeptical over historic grievances. Kim Mo-kyun reports.
Even before the summit was held, many news outlets across the globe provided a recap of the historic disputes between South Korea and Japan under both hopeful and skeptical headlines. Much of the focus was on whether the summit will bring dramatic change to the stalled relations and on what has likely prompted the two Asian countries to meet up and try to improve ties. There was also large interest in any reciprocal action from Japan following the South Korean government's concession to propose payouts from a Seoul-backed fund to the victims of Japan's forced labor during World War II instead of the Japanese firms responsible. CNN says the two most important Asian allies for the U.S. appear ready to turn over a new leaf. It says much of the two neighbors' rapprochement is driven by deepening security concerns about North Korea's frequent missile tests and China's increasingly aggressive military posturing and tensions across the Taiwan Strait, which is a vital security area for both Seoul and Tokyo. Reuters also explains that such an attempt at talks is mainly because of concerns over Pyongyang as well as Washington's competition with Beijing. The New York Times points out the relationship between the two countries is also important for the U.S. as it tries to contain China's growing presence. But despite what the summit's outcome may be, the newspaper says the leaders of the two sides still have much to bear, as public sentiment on both sides seem to be opposed to the thawing relations by putting aside their emotional historic past. Qatar's Al Jazeera also attributed the two countries' willingness to cooperate to the challenges posed by North Korea and China, but cited experts who are doubtful of a lasting rapprochement as historical grievances fester. The BBC referred to the two countries as frenemies, adding that the summit will act as a milestone that will decide their future diplomatic direction. It also mentioned the latest concession by the Yoon Suk-yeol government, claiming that Seoul has done more to restore the broken trust. Meanwhile, China's state-run Global Times is rather skeptical about the potential results, saying that even if the sensitive issue of forced labor compensation can be resolved, it will still be difficult to thaw icy bilateral ties. China's CCTV also reported in a similar tone, pointing the finger at Washington as a reason for South Korea's making of concessions on the long-stalled forced labor issue. Kim Mo-kyun, Arirang News.
Another one of President Yoon Suk-yeol's goals during his trip is to promote civilian exchanges between South Korea and Japan. Earlier today, when meeting with Korean Japanese people in Tokyo, Yoon asked for their help in doing so. Meanwhile, the second day of his visit will focus on economic cooperation. Our Kim Do-yeon, traveling with the president, has the details.
Besides from the diplomatic ties and trade disputes that President Yoon Suk-yeol wanted to settle through his trip to Japan, he also wanted to foster civilian exchanges. And as he went to lunch with 130 Korean Japanese and Korean nationals in Japan, his first official schedule in Tokyo, he called them the strongest support for the South Korea-Japan relationship and asked for their help.
자부심과 자긍심을 잃지 않고 각자 분야에서 활약하시는 동포 여러분 덕분에 일본 내 한국의 위상도 크게 향상됐습니다. 달라진 위상에 걸맞는 미래지향적인 한일 관계를 위해 여러분들께서 더 큰 역할을 해 주실 것이라고 믿습니다.
In fact, on his second and last day, the schedule will focus on promoting civilian exchanges. He's set to meet with business leaders of Japan, and this meeting comes as the two countries are starting to normalize their trade relations and pursue greater economic cooperation. There will also be 12 of business leaders of South Korea joining Yoon during this meeting. Many of them had faced some hurdles as Japan put export curbs on South Korean companies, but now, with the announcement that they've been lifted, it will be easier for them to do business with Japanese firms. Just before he leaves in the late afternoon, Yoon will also visit a local university to meet with students and academics. He will be giving a special lecture, and while not much has been shared on the topic, local media suspects the message will focus on the future generations' exchanges between the two countries. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News, Tokyo.
South Korea's recent purchasing decisions show a shift in consumer sentiment toward Japan. Our Lee Soo-jin went to find out how this is being reflected in marketing strategies and promotions.
South Korea and Japan are ready to turn a new page in their economic relations. Data from the Korea Customs Service shows that imports of Japanese beer this January soared over 300% on year to around $2 million, the highest since 2019 when Koreans boycotted Japanese products due to Tokyo's export controls. Amid the rebound in imports of Japanese beer, convenience stores are using character brands to get consumers to open their wallets. One leading convenience store chain has released 3 collaboration beers with the Japanese anime Jangu. But despite the Japanese brand on the can, the beer inside is locally produced.
The design of the beer cans is based on the famous Japanese anime Jangu, and the beer itself was brewed by domestic breweries, helping them improve their competitiveness.
Another convenience chain opened a pop-up store showcasing a crossover collection between Jangu and domestic clothing brand Ballansa. The collection includes limited edition hoodies, hats, and eco bags.
I believe that this crossover between a Japanese anime and a Korean brand has the potential to be a hit in Japan too, because Korean brands are popular among Japanese people.
It's not just marketing strategies that reflect a shift in consumer patterns. South Korea's low-cost carriers have been boosted by the weak yen and the addition of new flight routes. One budget airline has opened an experiential zone to promote its new Incheon-Takamatsu route.
Routes to Japan are especially important for low-cost carriers which typically operate medium and short-haul flights. The boarding rate came to only 30 to 40% before, but bookings have soared after the resumption of visa-free entry.
The experiential zone is set up with actual airplane seats from the airliner, and there are bags and suitcases that add to the feeling of being on a flight to Japan. This consumer trend is expected to continue.
Consumers will continue to buy products they like and which give them a sense of satisfaction. In other words, their spending choices will not be influenced by political or diplomatic factors.
While there's still a long way to go before economic relations between the two countries become completely normalized, these consumer patterns will serve as an important step forward. 이수진, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, here on the peninsula, North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile earlier this morning, hours ahead of the scheduled summit between South Korea and Japan. Our defense correspondent Kim Hyun-sung has details.
North Korea's 4th show of force in a week. North Korea fired another ballistic missile off to the East Sea, and this time it was a long-range missile. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff confirmed on Thursday morning. It was fired at a high angle and flew about 1,000 kilometers east. Japan's defense ministry said that the missile traveled for about 69 minutes and reached a maximum altitude of 6,000 kilometers. It added that the missile landed around 250 kilometers west of Japan's Oshima Island in Hokkaido Prefecture. Analysts gather from the flight data that this could be an intercontinental ballistic missile, likely the Hwasong-17. The Hwasong-17 is North Korea's largest nuclear-capable missile to date. Last year, Japanese Defense Minister Yasukazu Hamada mentioned that this weapon has the capability to reach the U.S. mainland with a potential range of 15,000 kilometers. But South Korea's military officials said that although this launch does bear some similarities to the Hwasong-17, they also did find some differences that could suggest otherwise, although these details cannot be disclosed at the moment. If this test did involve an ICBM, this would mark North Korea's 7th successful ICBM test since 2017. North Korea's latest weapons test comes on the day of South Korea and Japan's bilateral summit and before President Yoon Suk-yeol embarked on his 2-day visit to Tokyo. Their timing hints that North Korea is disgruntled by the rekindled relationship between Seoul and Tokyo.
This is to prevent and rally against the strengthened trilateral alliance between South Korea, the US, and Japan. They think that this could pose a greater threat to their regime.
The National Security Council on Thursday morning responded to North Korea's recent threats. National Security Advisor Kim Sung-an held an emergency standing committee with key players, including President Yoon Suk-yeol, before his flight. President Yoon said at this meeting that North Korea's reckless threats will have clear repercussions and called on the allies to step up their joint drills. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
South Korea and UAE have struck a deal to cooperate in promoting various sectors, including defense and energy. Trade Minister An Deok-keun attended a South Korean UAE business roundtable in Abu Dhabi on Thursday, along with 50 business delegates from South Korea. The two sides signed one contract in the defense sector worth $2 billion along with 4 MOUs. They also sought to strike a deal worth $5 million in a meeting that involved almost a dozen South Korean firms from the energy, defense, and smart farming industries, and 30 of their counterparts from the UAE. During a bilateral summit earlier this year, the UAE vowed to invest $30 billion in Seoul's nuclear power, energy, and arms sectors. It's been nearly 50 years since South Korea first established Commerce and Industry Day to celebrate the country's economic developments, and a recent report says the progress made during nearly half a century can be seen across multiple sectors. Data released by the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry on Thursday shows that the country's GDP was at $1.66 trillion last year, more than 85 times more compared to 1974. From a market mostly dominated by agriculture, fishing, and textiles, Korea's main industries are now in the IT, electronics, and finance sectors. This was prompted by the emergence of companies such as Samsung, Hyundai Motor, and POSCO back in the late 1960s. The country's exports have also multiplied by over 150 times since then. On a light note now, Korea's city of Cheongju has a library that accommodates a drive-through which allows you to borrow and return books from the comfort of your car. Jung Eun-ju explains.
A vehicle enters a booth set up at one side of a parking lot. Once the car stops, a small window opens and a book comes out. This is a drive-through library. The Yurbong Smart Library's book drive-through in Chungcheongbuk-do Province is the first of its kind in South Korea. The library recognizes vehicle license plate numbers and allows users to automatically borrow and return books. Smart libraries where users can apply to borrow a book online and pick them up from an unmanned system already exist. But this new drive-through library is more convenient. It's also possible to borrow books without car license plate number recognition but using membership cards. The library is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Yurbong Smart Library has about 250 books. The interlibrary loan service also enables users to pick up and return books from 19 libraries and 9 small libraries in the Cheongju area. The Cheongju Municipal Library expects the new system will help increase citizen satisfaction when using the library and promote reading.
We're the first library in the country to use the vehicle number recognition system. The service allows citizens to conveniently borrow books without getting out of the car if they have reserved a book online in advance.
The city of Cheongju plans to install unmanned libraries in areas where there are no public libraries and expand drive-through services based on the success of Yurbong Smart Library. Jung Eun-ju, Arirang News.
Conditions are forecast to stay chilly until tomorrow morning. Therefore, the contrast between mornings and daytime temperatures will be more dramatic, with lows plunging to 1 degree Celsius. The mild trend will begin by the afternoon as a warm front will settle into the nation by then. Partly cloudy skies and comfortable daytime temperatures are in store thereafter. A large part of South Korea's forecast experience dry and windy conditions. Currently, most inland regions are in dry weather advisories, including Seoul. This will create elevated risk of wildfires as dry vegetation can easily ignite and fires can spread when coupled with gusty winds. Please take precautions against fires. This may include avoiding outdoor fires and properly disposing of cigarettes and other smoking materials. Tomorrow, Seoul and Daejeon will be starting off at 1 degree. Temperatures will exceed the seasonal average by the daytime. Highs in Seoul will get up to 13 degrees. Gwangju 16, Gyeongju and Busan will be topping out at 14 degrees. And for the remainder of the week, wide temperature gaps of more than 10 degrees are expected. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That's all for tonight's newscast. Thank you for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the most up-to-date news. Good night.
Arirang TV has always been a highly informative and respected source of information.